Well, I find this very encouraging, the buzz in the room, that it's day 3 and everyone's still full of energy and actively partnering and connecting with each other, which I think is a really great sign. I'm going to be very brief today. We have a rock star panel up here, and I'd like to dedicate as much time as we can to them, but I'd just like to say thank you again for your active participation. And we have now over 8,000 meetings scheduled, 3,800 attendees, and just a really nice experience this week, I think, as we've seen all of the deals coming together. So I'd like to turn it over to Sarah, my partner in crime in this meeting. And Sarah, with that.
I'm here. I didn't disappear. I just moved. So as Tina said, I mean, as I've walked around the halls and I've talked to people and I've seen all the activity going on, this is probably one of the best biotech showcase, digital medicine, medtech showcases that we've had. Every breakout room post a company presentation was active and busy. I keep getting compliments on the quality of our panels, so you guys have to live up to those compliments, just so you know. And the quality as well of the companies. We've had over 400 presenting companies in all different fields, and you know, toward the end of the day today, we'll also have our our seed showcase. This year, we're up to close to 50 presenting companies in the Seed Showcase, so which gives you an idea of, you know, the interest that people have in the new, in the new technologies, the new stuff coming up. Before I introduce our great panel, I just wanted to do a quick recap of the plenary sessions that we've had. Monday was the political session, and for those of you who were here, it got political, let me put it that way. And it was both encouraging, stressing, you know, in a way with regard to what will happen to not only our country, you know, during the elections, but also to our industry. Big question mark, you know, the answers are not there yet. Yesterday, our focus was on pricing and pricing policy. In particular about how younger companies currently in development seeking financing should think about how they address the issues and the still unknowns yet, because there are so many unknowns in our industry. We had a great panel covering that as well. On Monday, part of the discussion, we had Jeremy Levin, he was on it. He's always very lively. And he was responsible as chair of Bio for penning an article that appeared in Stat News last week. And the article was entitled "The New Biotechnology and Pharmaceutical Industry Commitment to Patients." And it was signed by 215 people who were involved in the biopharmaceutical ecosystem. So that includes pharma people, biotech people, everybody who's in the game supporting this sector. I think a number of people on this panel were also signers of that. And the summary of it was, we need to ensure that we act with the highest integrity and corporate responsibility, always putting the interests of patients first. So the article was, you know, rather powerful. One of the things that Jeremy asked, and I told him that I would do, was that we would share the article and the forum, if you will, so that more people who are participating at our meeting could add their names to it. So when that comes out, I encourage all of you to join everybody in signing that document. So why are we out here? We're out here to look at financing and investment and deals to support the growth of our industry. Today's panel will focus on mega A rounds and mega IPOs and consolidation, and what's next on the horizon with fluctuating market conditions and investor confidence waning. I don't know if it is waning, is it? Compared to what's been going on. We are going to be hearing from a group of really great people who can opine on this subject, led by Eric Blanchard. Eric is a partner at Covington and Burling. He's in their New York office, and he's vice chair of their capital markets and securities practice, where he regularly represents innovative public and private companies in the biotech, pharmaceutical, and other life sciences sector. I encourage you all to encourage our panelists to speak. They're very shy. They don't often offer opinions, but I think you may be able to encourage them to do so, Eric.
I'll do my best.
So I turn it over to you.
All right, excellent. Thanks so much, Sarah. This is just a really terrific panel and a really timely topic. Mega A rounds, mega IPOs, and consolidation. So I guess what I'd like to do first is maybe have the panel introduce themselves, and then we can dive right in.
Sure, I'll start. Gabe Cavazos. I'm a managing director in the investment banking group at Leerink, SVB Leerink. I'm based out of the New York office. I cover biopharma. Split my time between M&A advisory and capital markets advisory.
Great. Hi, Jean Cunicelli, UPMC Enterprises, where I run our translational sciences investments. That's investments in therapeutics, diagnostics, and devices. I'm part of a $22 billion health system that's both a payer and a provider, so our investments obviously have lots and lots of expertise behind them. We formed actually just announced our fund of about $1 billion. I think we announced it Monday, so this topic is very timely for that type of raise.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kimberly Ha, founder and CEO at KKH Advisors. We focus on IPO communications, crisis communications, and pretty much PR, IR.
Hi, everyone. Marian Nakata. I'm with JJDC, Johnson & Johnson's Corporate Venture Group. We do strategic investing and deploy about $500 million in capital every year. We do about 20 new, 20 follow-on investments every year.
I'm Art Pappas. I'm the managing partner at Pappas Capital. We're an early-stage life science venture fund. We're based in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, but we invest across the United States.
Great, excellent. Thanks, everybody. So I think we'd start off, Gabe, with you. So this year, it's fair to say that the biotech IPO boom has continued. And as we've seen somewhat new development, there's been large tech for a number of years, big unicorn valuations in the high-tech sector. Now we're starting to see unicorns in the biotech sector with very large IPO valuations for Moderna, BioNTech, BridgeBio, and others. Gabe, would you mind giving us sort of an overview of the trends that you saw in this past year?
Sure, happy to. First I'll start by saying that 2019 was an outstanding year by every measure. In the context of dollars raised in biopharma for IPOs, it was over $9 billion raised. The number of deals that priced, I think it was 66, which was almost as much as 2015, which was a record year for biopharma IPOs. The difference between 15 and 19 was that the bar was higher. So, very high quality companies were able to raise capital in an efficient way with great investors, and those that probably weren't ready to go public weren't able to get out. And from our perspective, that's a good dynamic to have. 15 was a little frothy, valuations got a little ahead of themselves, and companies that probably weren't ready to go out were going public. And 16, as a result of that, was a tough year with a lot of failures, a lot of setbacks. So if you look at the 2019 class of IPOs, there is this trend of companies, even as private companies, doing larger Series A's, larger Series B's, raising more capital in the IPO. So the average deal size historically has been about $75–80 million. Now it's closer to 100. And we're seeing companies even raising, several $100 million. Gossamer raised over $300 million. So that trend is very real. Valuations are going up as well, I think, for all the right reasons. I do think that, and we've talked a little bit about it on the panel, that there are new funds kind of popping up every day. There's a lot of capital to deploy in healthcare and in biopharma in particular. And as a result, investors need to write big checks and deploy capital for companies that they think are going to be big. So they do the diligence, they do the work, they spend the time. For them, putting $5 million to work isn't going to move the needle. They need to put 20, into a private company or more. So I think that's why we're seeing some of these very, highly innovative, big idea companies like a BioNTech or a Moderna or a BridgeBio having a, I don't want to say an easy time, but a fairly efficient time raising large amounts of money in the private markets. And then once you're, a big company, you need to do a big IPO, right? You need to float a significant percentage of the company. So I don't see that trend really ending anytime soon. I think for a company like a BioNTech in particular, Eric and I worked on that one, they'll have 10 programs in the clinic this year, right? So they need to raise a lot of capital. The last thing they want to do is hold back on innovation or hold back on putting programs into the clinic because they don't have the right amount of capital. So I think we'll see that trend grow.
That's great. That's great to hear. So as we go into 2020, it's something that we've all been talking about for probably well over the last year is the election on the horizon, political risk in the market, for the IPO market. I think we saw that manifest into reality, in 2015 or so. Curious to hear what you're advising companies going into 2020 as far as maybe timing or, sort of what the expectation is for the coming year.
Sure, yeah. So we're very optimistic, I think, and most would agree the sentiment here is very positive. We had there were a number of big follow-ons that priced and performed well last week. There were a couple M&A transactions, not as many as people expected last year. We had BMSLG, we had Loxo, Lilly. So, I think it's the sentiment's positive. I think that the pipeline. I at least look at our pipeline and other companies that I know that are filed confidentially to go out. Very high quality companies. The kind of advice for the past 9 months has been, if you want to go public in 2020, you should think about a first half IPO because of the election, right? We don't know what's going to happen around the election. Right. So the first half of the year will be very busy, and it already is. I think there's an IPO pricing tomorrow, and a number that have filed publicly and intend to go out after Memorial or after MLK. So yeah, I think that trend will continue. Our organization, our equity capital markets organization, takes a little bit of a contrarian view in that for the most part, banks have been saying that the second half of the year is going to be very quiet. We think for very high quality companies that have great investors, significant insider support, we'll be able to get them out in September and October, assuming that the markets are conducive and that the feedback's positive. So in November we'll be quiet, and December, who knows, depending on the outcome of the election. But we think there'll be a lot of deal making this year. Okay,
that's great. That's a great positive message. And before we're going to go to Art to get perspective on sort of venture capital trends, but before we do, I want to pause for 1 second. Kim, you mentioned that you maybe have a perspective on sort of companies from China coming into the U.S. and maybe this would be a good time to sort of provide a view on sort of that trend and what you're seeing.
Sure, thanks, Eric. I think to follow on to what Gabe said, obviously I think on my watch list is IMAB, that's pricing tomorrow, I believe. I think they're looking to raise $100 million. Chinese biotech, it's going to be the second U.S. listing, after Zai Lab. So I think that's interesting. I think last year on the panel we were talking about, and a lot of companies are thinking, with U.S.-China operations, should I be evaluating the Hong Kong Stock Exchange or should I be looking at the NASDAQ? I think, it's still I'm going to Hong Kong in March, actually. Originally, I'm from Hong Kong. And so I think this level of sophistication in terms of U.S. investors is really unparalleled. So I think at the crux of it, the importance of having the right investor story. And, although you might have the right investor story for an Asian investor market, that might not necessarily translate into the same valuation, especially for Asian companies that are looking to do a dual listing on the NASDAQ. I think that's sort of been the tricky thing. I've also talked to companies that have, done interesting, I guess from a structural standpoint, do we actually set up a U.S. subsidiary or basically spin out the technology into U.S. holding and basically do the rebrand. I think that has also been successful. So I think, let's see what happens with Zai Lab's IPO. I think, to your point about election year, historically, I'm sure Lyric has that data too. Gabe has more data than me. But, if we look at the IPOs that went out in the last election year, 2016, with Editas, Intellia, CRISPR, gene editing companies, there's obviously Hillary's tweet. We were just talking about that, so that sent the sector down. But I think, historically, in an election year, the deal value and also the number of deals is pretty much you're looking at a 50% lower rate. But if you have a strong story, I think to Gabe's point, we're going to see a lot of strong IPOs. We're actually working on a few together actually this year, so I'm excited.
Terrific.
Optimistic.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So Art, would you mind sort of commenting on venture capital investments and whether you think the positive viewpoint that Gabe has expressed sort of carries through into the private ranks?
So I agree with the way Gabe kind of highlighted the market. I also agree with Kimberly. If we look at just geography as part of the trends, and now that the regulations have been issued on CFIUS, which has been a big concern, I think we're going to see more comfort with Chinese companies coming into the market. The only ones that have been, only geographic areas that have been excluded under CFIUS are Canada and Australia. So we're going to see more geographic play here, and China in particular, I believe, like Kimberly said, will present an interesting investment opportunity. Europe also, as many of you may have heard, there's large pockets of money being put in place in the UK, in the Netherlands, to stimulate science further. A couple of years ago, the SV started managing this fund on cognitive disease, and with pharma companies, it's a 15-year fund, so they recognize the importance of the long benefit. So the geographical plays here, I think, are going to be important, and they're going to play into positive trends. On the technology side, I think as we begin to see more cures come forward, it's just going to further stimulate the interest by the investors to come into venture funds or to do larger funds to allow companies to take advantage of the public markets. I do agree we're going to see more of these mega rounds come together, and we, as a small fund, look to get into those, but it's a different approach. At the same time, I do believe we're going to see more of these early stage opportunities come forward with smaller rounds in order to be a feeder to the next round. And I think that's going to be appropriate because that smaller round may not have the entire platform sorted out, and they'll want to take one step at a time and get some kind of FDA endorsement before going forward. And I know Gene's going to speak on this as well, because what the universities are doing is they better industrialize their whole tech transfer platform. We're seeing higher quality ideas come out of the university, so you're going to need to have some early stage investing. So I think those trends are going to continue. I can't comment on the elections. I think the data you just shared, Kimberly, is pretty interesting. But it will slow down in the second half of the year. We've got some companies we're pushing out in the second quarter. So.
Okay. Just to follow up on one thing that you mentioned, CFIUS. And CFIUS, for us at Covington, has been something that we've been really focused on. We're very active in looking at that topic for a number of companies and investors. It has had an interesting impact on venture capital, and I know it's something that VCs are looking at now. Do you have a view on how VCs are thinking about CFIUS and the sort of trend now with the new CFIUS rules on how important it is to have that as a risk item when you're considering deals?
Yeah. So with the regulations now out, it's pretty clear what we can show and not show to a LP that may be a Chinese firm, for example. In our case, we have Shanghai Pharma as one of our limited partners, and that's the #3 publicly traded pharma company in China. And we've had that exposure all along. And the dynamic with that is mostly around, will we be able to do a filing if we need to, if we have to file under CFIUS because we have this information that we're providing to this LP. That's now pretty clear. We're going to know if there's a technology based on the list that was just published. If it's so novel and it's in a restricted area, then we'll figure out how to have that distributed among our pharma company LPs that may not be U.S. companies. So I think the playing field is a little bit more open now, so we're going to be able to approach it more positively.
Excellent.
We're not shying away, for example, in our next fund from bringing in another Chinese pharma company. We're just not shying away from that.
Okay, excellent. And I guess maybe a question open to the panel. We saw one of the trends that you mentioned, Gabe, is valuations continue to increase. I think the same is true in venture capital. I guess, is that trend, you mentioned that you thought the trend would continue to increase. What are the dynamics that you think are behind that trend? And is that trend uniform across the various parts of biotech, or is it concentrated in a certain type of company? And see if you have any thoughts on that.
Let me just add one comment to that, because I think it's an important point you're raising. We're seeing for the first time a lot of venture dollars going into manufacturing. We've never seen manufacturing. We shied away from that kind of capital expense. It's not part of the capital efficient equation that we try to go after. So that's a dominant trend that's going to occur, particularly as these gene therapy companies need, or these other gene platforms are going to need to control all components of that. And that's going to drive higher valuations, but also larger rounds.
So let me talk to that for a second. Took words right out of my mouth. As we think about how we put to work our capital, we think about the entire value chain, and more and more and more. We are absolutely in the sweet spot of putting manufacturing in the hands of the companies. Waiting 18 months for a CRO and making sure that they behave as advertised is not always easy for a small fledgling company. Not to mention that process makes or breaks the effect on the patient. I think we saw with some of the CAR-Ts, for instance, that the manufacturing process, wasn't as predictable. And so to your point, in my opinion, is, talking about valuations, I think it's for a select few, because I think there are so many companies who still need to build and scaffold, and they need too much cash is too much cash. It's a very different model. And so you called it a unicorn. Let's keep it as such, because if there's 2,500 overcapitalized, I'm not suggesting they're all overcapitalized, but they all need every dollar they raised. You don't have to answer that.
It's a great point.
But it is a risk, right? You're right, it is a risk. I mean, the reason the industry stumbled a number of years ago is because everything was going into these fully integrated pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah.
And we had money going into everything.
So you have to tailor it.
Yeah.
And I still believe, even with the size fund we have, it has to be tailored. You mentioned the earlies. We put as little as $500,000 to work and escalate from there. We have a lot of first-time founders. We have what we call cutting-edge science. We may do 30 of those, and one of them makes it forward. And we can take it through a non-GLP tox and then spin it out into the world. When we do direct investing that's not from, we are UPMC, but we're fortunate enough to be next to the University of Pittsburgh. When we do direct investing that's across the country, we'll set the valuation to what makes sense. What is the life cycle of this company? So would I like us to be part of some of these mega rounds? Yes, for the right company. It's a different path. They're more likely to go public rather than be acquired, I'm guessing, because of the pricing. That's great if somebody like you can make it work. So I would hope that not all boats are going to float up with the valuations. You want the right valuation. If it's,
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes our job harder, right, when the valuation is dislocated relative to the
and then we're
comps
sitting there
and
saying you got to hold up our valuations that we overpriced.
It creates an incredible challenge. And I agree. I mean, look, in 2019 was also a year where, many of the IPOs that got out were manufactured to get out, right? I mean, they had big Series A's and big Series B's, and so there's a lot of investors involved and a lot of capital to support the IPO. So these deals are launching with 100% of the deal covered by insiders, so it's effectively, engineered to get out. So I don't know that that's necessarily healthy. I do think that the market's not frothy, right? Because we've seen that. We've seen valuations get over their skis. A lot of these manufactured IPOs were going out at nearly flat to the post on the last private, so looking for little to no step up. So there's discipline there, and I think the banks and the boards and the investors have learned the lesson of what happens when valuations get ahead of themselves.
And you're still getting a lot of insider support, which is they're comfortable holding the valuation. That's right.
Because you also don't want to, there's one company that approached me to ask me this question, and, the question was, because I'm dealing with media, they raised a lot of financing, when the market was really hot. And then now, investor sentiment has kind of moved to the next hot thing, and then now they're stuck in a position where they're in an absolute down round. So the question now becomes, okay, what do we do from here? There's a lot of the smart investors are like, okay, we're on to the next thing in oncology right now. And then now, in the next round, it might be a constituency of investors that are not your typical biotech investors.
More and more.
Yeah. So, I think it's, like when the market was hot, we were seeing like this crazy like triple-digit Series A financing rounds. And then some of my clients were like, we have a phase 3 product and we're only raising like $40 million. What's happening here? And then companies were slapping on like AI, machine learning, and then these like crazy blockchain companies, like all the hype, right? So I think since this, I don't know if this panel includes digital health IPOs, but I also work with a number of digital health companies, and it's like these digital health companies now are also raising really large Series A round valuations, like $50 million Series A, and I think you'll see more digital health companies. I don't know, Gabe, if you're working with digital health companies, but I think we'll also see a lot of these exits sort of in that unicorn range this year.
Yeah.
So
I'm not. I do think that the big raises are a function of the lessons learned over the past few years, right? And your point about manufacturing, there's a company that we're quite fond of. It's a cell therapy company, and they're 2 years away from data, and they've already got a GMP manufacturing facility that they own, right? And they raised $250 million in a Series A. Because the product is the process, right? And it's incredibly important to be ahead of that and not have capacity constraints limit value.
Well, pharma is the one that helped us with all that. They wouldn't buy unless we had all the pieces in
Right,
place,
exactly.
including good CMC.
Exactly.
Right.
Absolutely. Well, that's a terrific discussion. I think it hits on a lot of the themes that we're seeing, and the product is the process for cell therapy companies is something that we've heard a lot. I guess you mentioned that you think that things will continue to go through 2020. The valuations will stay pretty steady. Is that?
No, I said I hoped.
You hoped, okay.
It's good for the companies. It would be, for the time being, a high valuation is a great thing. And then this description of what do you do when do you recover from a down round? It's a very difficult.
How do you recover?
How do you cover it? And,
Hopefully people in the audience are dealing with this right now, but what are the,
and you've been through it. It's so, to stay rational and grounded. That's why I keep calling them unicorns. I get it. Several should have these $1 billion out of the gate unicorn pricing. Is that what's good for every company? I doubt it. I doubt it. And sometimes it is a marathon and not a sprint, right? And some fundamentals have to play into it.
Yeah, so the median, if you look at the 2019 IPO class, the median post on the last private is like $240 million, right? So it's still a relatively big valuation, but they're not all creeping, up towards $1 billion. There are 3 or 4 outliers. But
That's plenty.
Yeah.
Would you advise a company to take a lower valuation? In an earlier round than maybe they want?
I always do.
Yeah.
But it's not a lower valuation. Call it an appropriate valuation. Because at least you have to, or we try to work with our companies. I'm sure everybody does this. And you show them, you can't always assume someone's going to buy you preemptively. You cannot assume that the IPO window or somebody as nice as you is going to figure out how to take them public and have something supportive post-public, right? That's an important point. How do they perform? If you show them the life cycle, that's a really important piece, and that the capital is there over that life cycle. Some may want, I mean, we may decide that some deserve a $50 to $75 million round. That's great, and we can certainly afford a different valuation on that. So I think it's tailored. I don't call them lower valuations. I call them appropriate, depending on the life cycle and where that company's headed.
And what's important to remember is we're talking about the success stories, right? The companies that made it out. There are countless others behind this that haven't made it and won't at their current valuation because they've raised capital in an efficient way, and they're not, the board or whoever the stakeholders aren't recognizing that the world has moved away from where they were when they raised capital last time, right? So it's
Well, last year, the formula was this $150 million number to get a company out. Today, it's $250 million. So when you show the plan, or you work with an investing round like Gene is talking, it brings reality back to the equation. So sometimes the B round is going to be flat because you're already pressing on that number.
And if you don't go IPO, you have to think about M&A. So then you think, what is the multiples back for the valuation? And if you're up to a place where it's ludicrous, you're not going to be able to get the M&A if that's what the route you need to go, right?
That's right. So I guess segueing maybe off of that into something sort of side by side with it, as you're looking at companies that either to invest in from a VC side, or companies that may be ready to or approaching being ready for an IPO, what is the profile of these companies? What are you looking for as investors, and I guess what would you see as the profile, putting aside the manufactured, kind of pre-baked IPO candidates? I mean, what are you seeing as far as the qualities of a biotech company that might be ready to have an IPO? Maybe Kimberly, you can.
I mean, I think a lot of people come to me and they're like, can you help me package this together and do the messaging and come up with a cool name and launch it to, and it's just like I've seen spectacular failures in terms of working with certain companies that, try to do the IPO too early. Gabe and I were having this conversation. I think, the important thing is you really only have one shot to do the IPO right. So do not rush it, and make sure that you have the right story, you have the right management team. Ideally, especially for ex-US companies, that you make sure that you have independent board members that have done this rodeo before, and they've done a successful US IPO or an M&A exit. You surround yourself with advisors and bankers that you have confidence with. And I think the other thing I would say is what are your upcoming milestones, right? Like, do you actually have material upcoming events for the investor? When you're pitching investor, they're going to say like, okay, great, what's the next pivotal event, right? They're not going to buy into an IPO that you've got a data readout like 12 months away. Like, no one's going to wait so long for that. So and it's also, I get a lot of questions, do we sign the large pharma partnership deal before we do the IPO? Like, would that be a proof point, or should we wait and do the IPO and then have that large pharma partnership as an inflection point, and sell that into the roadshow? I mean, these are all questions that everyone on this panel is dealing with all the time, and the investors on the panel can shed more light on what is an attractive IPO candidate. But I think you have to have at least U.S. clinical data. I think for a lot of Chinese companies that are trying to do an IPO without U.S. data, it's going to be pretty grueling unless you have like a spectacular star CEO that every investor knows or something. I think the board, the management team, who's actually leading the company. And then it's also, transparency, right? So I think, feel free to chime in, but I think it's also a bit of luck and a bit of timing, So when you're actually going out and, are you actually going against the flow, or are you actually, I think especially, on another topic, what types of companies will we see? We had this discussion on the call. I think, there was a year where we saw like all IO companies IPOing and doing secondary rounds at the same time. Like Iovance raised like a huge secondary follow-on round after like Juno and Kite got sold. Yeah, and they had, that company, Maria's great. It's an amazing turnaround story, and the rebrand, actually worked with the company on that. And I think there's other companies that are like, oh great, we are also in this space, let's just try to see if we can go out. It doesn't work like that, because US investors are sophisticated, they meet with so many companies on a daily basis. And I used to be an investigative reporter for the Financial Times, so it's kind of like, they're gonna, I'm not going to curse on this panel. I promised Sarah I wouldn't. But it's like, do you have a convincing investor story? And I think, it's just like, not to, mention Theranos, but it's like the power of the investor story in terms of raising like whatever fund. It's just so important that a lot of companies overlook, because a lot of times you might have like the science founder CEO, and they're so granular, and they're like 40-page pitch deck, but like at the end of it, you're like, what did I actually sit through? Like, what does your company actually do? Like, I don't really know, I was like, I don't even know what you guys do. Like, so I think like having a compelling mission statement, the differentiating story, what's that unique hook, right? Like, what is that? So I think, Gabe's probably worked with so many companies, and bankers and lawyers also help work on S1 messaging, and we're field testing it too. I think test the water meetings are so important, because we'll get the feedback ahead of time to see like, is this story sticking with investors? And if not, okay, let's go back and let's see what is actually, how do we communicate the story? Because the worst case scenario is if you have a really effective drug that's going to help a lot of patients, but you have like the wrong story and the wrong everything, and then you just can't get investor interest, and it's just like you can't even get financing for it, and then you're just stuck. So,
I'm sorry.
No, and on that note, I think you also have to have cash in the bank when you go out. So that's just from a timing perspective, you can't be using an IPO when you're out of cash in 3 months, because that's not how it works. You need probably like a year of cash, ideally, in the bank when you go out. So that's another important point.
Yeah, there's two parts to that, your question there. What's the right profile to go out? And then most of the companies don't fill that profile. They're just taking advantage of the fact that the market is able to raise money. For me, the ideal company to take out is one that's truly phase 3 ready and has a year of cash on the balance sheet. If you're really phase 3 ready, that means you've checked the boxes on the clinical side, the CMC side, you've got manufacturing alternatives. Now you've got a solid story. But we know we've got a lot of companies
that's not really what we've been seeing. That's
right. Because if you truly are, then pharma's going to come in right behind and pluck it out of the queue.
Yeah.
That's good.
I mean, yeah, you see, it is a bit of a kind of bell curve in the context of how where companies are in their stage of development. We've seen a number of preclinical companies going public, or those that are in phase 1 that don't have data yet in man.
So that's it. Let's stop there. The difference between great, and that's a dream the upside, and there's less risk in that than going with something with substance may be the wrong word, but that readout that comes at a phase 3.
Post proof of concept.
Yeah, that's a different formula now, and that hopefully is such an exception, because what you can't have on the other side is a bunch of companies that weren't successful sitting there in that sort of public pool, which has happened to the biotech industry in the past. You're saying we've learned from our mistakes, let's hope.
Yeah. These are often platform companies, right?
Sure.
Novel technology, gene therapy, gene editing,
And they
cell
need
therapy.
that cash, and they have great investors now.
Yeah.
And I think those will normalize in valuation also, because look at the way the pharmaceutical industry is now structured their licenses. You don't get paid. If you get paid a little bit on first patient in the trial, you get paid a little bit.
Yeah.
The real payout is first commercial sale. So that knowledge of each of these inflection points is going to play out pretty interestingly as we watch these companies develop in the market, and it'll normalize. I think it'll normalize. You'll have to normalize, because the basic elements of moving these programs forward are going to be what they are.
Makes a lot of sense. So we mentioned, as far as things to look out for on being IPO ready, news flow, having a good mission statement, having cash. On that last point, I guess, is it continuing to be an important element to go out to have the marquee investors who can reinvest in the IPO.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you
And 70% of the round has to be
Inside
covered
to
by
be
the insiders.
Right.
Yeah, or more.
Or more
Or
sometimes.
Yeah, so the crossover phenomenon is not going away. I mean,
Yeah.
it's 3 years ago it was a nice to have, now it's a need to have, it really is. I mean, you look at the data, and those that haven't done a crossover round, they don't price as well, they don't perform as well, and they on average, and they don't have as high evaluations. And there are a lot of them that don't even get out, frankly, because they don't have the insider support. And most of the most active book runners need to see a very healthy amount of insider support before they'll have the conviction to launch a transaction. So it really is.
Is the size that you're seeing of the average crossover round increasing, or is it still around like the 40 to 50? I mean, obviously depending on company, but just like general average.
Yeah,
Do you see that
I think it
increasing?
is increasing. I think that I haven't looked at that data, but my instincts are it is increasing. I mean, historically we said you really should be raising 35 to 40 in a mezz round because you want to bring in 4 or 5 new investors, each putting 5 to 7 to work. That number's gotten a lot bigger.
Yeah.
And
That whole formula has evolved.
Yeah.
Is the number getting bigger because these investors want to just put more money to use in something that they like? Like they don't want to cut a $1 or $2 to $5 million check. They want to cut a $20 million check.
that's exactly right.
For
I
an
mean,
impact,
Yeah.
right?
well, yeah, because if they're going to, these guys have, 100 opportunities sitting on their desk, and they can invest in 3 or 4. And if they're going to do the work, do the diligence, spend the time, they want to deploy real capital, and then, put twice that to work in the IPO. So I absolutely agree.
Okay. And which kind of leads into the overall theme of large private rounds, large IPOs for those particular companies. Does the pushing of putting more capital to use, leading to larger, earlier rounds for these crossovers, is that leading to a lower step up over the IPO? Is it just sort of pushing forward the valuation event to that crossover round rather than the IPO?
That's exactly right. Yeah, step-ups have compressed, and for a lot of the bigger situations, the sentiment is that we don't really need a step up. We'll kind of, we'll appreciate into our full value over time with data. I mean, these are big companies. Like I'll use BioNTech as an example as well, right? 10 programs in the clinic, 4 different therapeutic modalities in oncology. I mean, there are a lot of ways to appreciate.
At least they know they have to catch up to their valuation.
Yeah, well, I think this phenomenon 5 years ago of public investors investing into private companies because they wanted to get a better allocation and they wanted to lock in a 70% gain or a 1.7 times step up, that's gone away, right? That expectation isn't there anymore. It's really that they recognize that there are great companies and they want to get in early and they want to get in at a potentially lower valuation than they would otherwise have to if buying in the open market.
And I think that's something that we've seen in the high-tech industry for a number of years now, and I think what we've seen sort of outside of biotech, but in tech, is the exact same dynamic where the big valuation mover ends up being the private round before the IPO, and that's driving some folks to think about direct listings and things of that nature, which I think is not quite ready for the biotech world, but it's something out there that, as these dynamics sort of continue to progress, it might be something that
Well, why don't you
we might
think
talk about
direct
future panels.
listings are right for biotech?
Well, I said it, so I'll start the conversation. I think that there's some expectation when you're conducting an IPO that there's some capital to be raised and deployed. I haven't yet seen a scenario. I mean, again, we've been talking about BioNTech. They did a fairly small IPO. They had a large amount of cash on the balance sheet already, so that might be approaching that where the liquidity event for the investors is the IPO, of course. But if you just want to have a liquidity event so that investors can sell or the company can have currency to do acquisitions, et cetera, but you don't need the money in the IPO, then a direct listing might be an option. But I think for biotech companies, I imagine it would be hard to pass up a opportunity to raise money, since biotech companies always need to raise
Yeah.
money every 1 or 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think you miss out on being able to build a book and allocate shares in the right way to investors that you care about, that know the story and that are going to be long-term, fundamentally driven investors. And you also lose the equity research component that comes with marketing a deal the proper way, right? Where you have 4 or 5 or 6 research analysts initiating coverage 30 days after the pricing, and that's for novel science and highly innovative companies, it's incredibly important.
Absolutely, and I think the going through that process of doing the testing the waters, refining your message. Kimberly works with companies, but I think there's a terrific handoff that happens from the pre-IPO advisors to the IPO banking team and other IPO advisors that come along, and the lawyers as well, to kind of like define it, craft it, and so that you're truly IPO ready. And of course that can happen in a direct listing as well, but I think that even if you get 1 or 2 large investors in your IPO and the rest is subscribed by current investors, I mean, that seems like a win to me. I mean, yeah.
Absolutely.
All right, well, that's a terrific topic. So I guess, so Jean, so we talked a little bit about UPMC and the work that you're doing there and how you're sort of leading sort of integration of tech investing transfer. Do you want to mention a little bit about what you have going on there and sort of some of the dynamics that you guys might be sort of ahead of the curve?
Tech transfer, when I first, it puts this kind of look on my face. It's never an easy process. But redefining it, which I think we have done, we have a very close partnership. And just to be clear, UPMC and Pitt, as I mentioned earlier, are separate. But what we have are clinicians who practice within the UPMC health system, and they have another hat where they research. Turns out Pitt is one of the top 5 NIH recipients in the country and has been. But could you name a drug that has come from Pitt? I think there's maybe 1 or 2, but not recently. So you have UPMC sitting here, which has grown, as one of the first combination health providers and payers. So they have this entrepreneurial spirit and this willingness to take risk, and they're constantly thinking, how do we reinvent healthcare? And we're at a point in healthcare where you have to seriously think about this now, between access, between costs, and there's a hospital system in Pittsburgh thinking about all of this, so they take a lot of risk. My fund is one of the ways they do that. They have $2 billion they're putting into the ground to think about hospitals of the future. They're thinking about telemedicine, and we have another side of our shop that's digital health. So sitting next to Pitt, they're doing all of this, and yet we hadn't built the translational piece through Pitt. So 3 years ago, when they came to me and asked me to think about $200 million, our first step toward this $1 billion was to put a foundation in place where the transfer of technology, where is Pitt the best? We spent a lot of time walking the halls of the immunology department, which is fast growing to become one of the best in the country. We had recruits coming in from the NIH, from all over, Dr. Josie Sahel from Paris, so we had a vision specialist, which sort of turbocharged Pitt's thinking about how they transfer technology. So we had some perfect storm things coming. But I will tell you, even being that close, the process of taking technology, making sure that we could identify the right question, how we think about intellectual property versus how the tech transfer thinks about intellectual property, was no small feat. We happened to bring in a nationally recognized intellectual property firm from day one to take a look at this intellectual property and think about it from an industry standpoint. So I had the benefit of not knowing a lot about tech transfer and just decided any rules that lasted before really didn't apply. It made no sense. It was very cumbersome. It was 2 different missions. And so what we have done, I think, and it's because of the collaboration between the 2 systems, is defined it in a way where both missions are met. So that what we do, and we do well, from bringing out the best of Pitt to put into several companies, and we did not fund everything, so this was not an economic development effort, and making sure that the way we did this was market rate. Pitt then became part of the founders' shares because their scientists were the ones with the intellectual property. UPMC did not, and we did a lot of the work to get these companies off the ground. I just fundamentally did not believe that for first-time founders, keep showing them that they have this pile of ownership, but then we keep taking from that pile of ownership. Just didn't feel right. But Pitt, now our incentives are aligned. So that was the start of how we did that. And again, we did the first 2 years of this effort perfecting that. So at the end of the day, we have this engine of very early ideas. I mean, the cutting edge of science, whether it's immunology, vision, aging. It feeds into what I would call almost an internal R&D pipeline, where we can take things, as I mentioned earlier, through non-GLP tox. We may have 30 of things go through there, but not all 30 are going to make it. And our job is to cut them off sooner rather than later so that that creative scientist can go back, because the process of transferring his technology in the first place wasn't so hard, go back and have a new idea. So I don't know, that's just to me seemed to be practical, because what do you do? So you've got a license out of the university. What do you do with it?
Right.
Not everything should become a company. Not everything's ready for partnering. So we have this other piece that's still internal, and then they grow up and some of them become companies. So I know it's long-winded, but there was a lot of thought behind this process. And I didn't study other tech transfer models. I didn't study any of that. I just figured what was the most pragmatic way to jumpstart a system that had all of this amazing research going on, where you could let the university protect its basic mission, and yet our mission would be to apply it. And we have a couple of companies out here now, and the reception has been quite positive. So the testament to this system that we have is that, at least 2 of them are going to hopefully announce some syndicates over the next month or 2. And now the next phase of this is to do more global and direct investing, call it traditional venture capital, and across the United States, best-in-class work. So
Sure.
anyway,
Oh,
it's
that's,
just a little different, but it was worth it, I think.
That sounds really exciting. I think being able to, advance the science of the university without, having the risk of outside investors come in, being able to
Do the right ones,
Yeah,
not
that's right.
everything. That was important.
So you can sort of pick for the university
Yeah.
the winners
Yeah,
at an early
there's
stage.
a lot, yeah.
That's great. That's terrific. Are you seeing other universities try employ this approach as well, or hospitals?
I think so, but because UPMC is in a very privileged position with cash, what we have put to work here is it's its own fund in the past couple of years, and we did it quickly. So that's the differentiator, I would think. And now this next billion, that magnitude, they kind of got it that needed to be the next generation. But I think there's several out there that are we've seen the Parker Institute. You see what's going on in New York. So yeah, there's some pretty interesting models.
So I'm sneaking up here to implore Eric to perhaps open it up to questions
Sure.
in the audience. So we do have 2 standing mics, and if you'd like to ask questions of this great panel, please note that we don't want a book report, we want a question. We don't want a statement, we want a question, and when we're ready. So Eric?
Sure, absolutely. I guess we have...
Yes, please. My name is Jim Manuso. I'm with Telfinium Investments. And my question is, when you have early stage companies, the vision often occludes the valuation, and all the way up to an IPO perhaps. So how do you balance out the difference in valuations between buyers on the one hand, institutionalized and otherwise, along with the angels and others that really kickstart things?
You wash them out? No, just
So please also speak into your mics, speak up.
It's an important balance. It really is, and it's that early expectation when you do the seed stage stuff, particularly with angels, that you get the expectation right. And my view on that, and I think my colleagues would probably say the same thing, is you try not to price those early rounds.
Right.
You try to do it in a way that it'll convert and give the process that's going to take us to a valuation point that makes sense in place. And then if there is a cram down or something occurs, there's a protective mechanism in there. They're converting into whatever that'll be.
And it depends how competitive it is.
Yeah.
If you only have one term sheet and it's at a very low valuation and it's either that or nothing,
Yeah.
those are your choices. So I think that's the other dynamic, how much competition you have.
Even where we think we know what the valuation should be, if we do a seed round, we do converts. We just don't try to price it. let the market price
Yeah.
it for us, not from our own end.
Right, any other questions?
You can tell there were a lot of parties last night. So-
All right, so I guess that means we're almost out of time.
6 seconds.
Yeah, 6 seconds, 4 seconds.
Okay, that's
So
great.
any other questions going
Any other
once, going
questions?
twice? If not,
All right, well, I'd like to thank the panel. This has been a terrific conversation, and thanks everybody for coming.
so I do an official thank you also. So on behalf of Demy-Colton and my partner EBD Group, I'd like to thank you, Eric, for being a sponsor, Art, Marion, Kimberly, Jean, and Gabe. Thank you very much for joining us again this year. So you're free. You're free to go.